Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, while US headlines were dominated by that hurricane, the White House took the opportunity for what's known as a Friday news dump as President Trump signed an order banning transgender people from joining the military and pardoned a highly controversial Arizona sheriff who'd been convicted of criminal contempt. One of his most right-wing advisors has suddenly left the administration as well. Here's James Blake.
As America's first family went to spend the weekend storm watching from Camp David, the president left behind a White House buffeted by yet more political controversy. First up, a contentious presidential pardon. The self-proclaimed toughest sheriff in America, Joe Arpaio, was a high-profile supporter of Donald Trump during the election. He became a hero of the right with a systematic policy of targeting and detaining undocumented immigrants. But in July, Joe Arpaio was convicted of defying a federal court order to stop racial profiling. In a speech to supporters in Phoenix earlier this week, the president hinted that a pardon was on its way.
Was Sheriff Joe convicted for doing his job? That's what... He should have had a jury, but you know what? I'll make a prediction. I think he's going to be just fine, okay?
Now 85 years old, the ex-sheriff would have been sentenced in October and could have spent up to 6 months in prison. President Trump put an end to that.
Well, I'm very honored. It's a great privilege for the president to issue this paper, pardon. He's a big supporter of law enforcement. I know it came from his heart.
Yet fellow Republican Senator John McCain has tweeted the pardon undermines the president's claim for the respect of rule of law. Amidst the growing maelstrom, another senior presidential aide is out of a job. Sebastian Gorka was the administration's media outrider and Fox News regular.
He's saying don't test America and don't test Donald J. Trump.
In a resignation letter posted online, Mr. Gorka writes, "The individuals who most embodied and represented the policies that will make America great again have been internally countered, systematically removed, or undermined in recent months." He joins close ally Steve Bannon and Anthony Scaramucci as the latest collateral damage of the man known as the General. The new Chief of Staff, John Kelly, has, it seems, brought some military discipline to the West Wing. Yet the change hasn't stopped Mr. Trump following through on some of his controversial promises. He has now officially issued the Pentagon a decree which bans the US military from taking on any new transgender recruits.
James Blake on the storm behind the storm.
So let's talk Brian Stelter. Brian, this is your beat. This is what you do.
News dumps?
Well, you talk about the media. You're a senior media correspondent. There's a reason they did a news dump on a Friday night. But not only that, with a Category 4 hurricane barreling off the coast of Texas.
I think Seb Gorka has something to do with this. Gorka had written a resignation letter, a stinging letter that criticizes Trump for listening to the moderates like Ivanka and Jared, and not listening to the Steve Bannons. So he writes this letter. He's being forced out of his job. This announcement is coming. And what happens? We hear from the president that he's pardoned Joe Arpaio. There seems to be a connection between these two Friday night stories. Seb Gorka leaving the White House is a bad news story for the Breitbarts of the world, for far right outlets. In fact, Breitbart's leading with Seb Gorka resigning, even though the White House says he's been forced out. So we roll out the Arpaio story. I wonder if that was the White House's strategy, but forget about that for a moment. This hurricane is hurting and killing people right now along the coast of Texas. And the White House's focus is I don't want to say focusing. They can do multiple things at once. But why in the world would you announce this when FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security are supposed to be focusing on this storm? Why would the president want to divert even 1 minute of attention away from the flooding, away from the collapsed buildings in Rockport, away from the emergency on the coast of Texas?
We saw it earlier this week
Why?
in Phoenix, because it's all about him.
Is that the answer?
Juliet?
That's going to be sad in a couple of days when we start to see just how bad it is on the Texas
Juliet,
coast.
do you disagree? That's the only observation.
No, I don't. I mean, you heard me last hour. It is. I mean, we have to applaud the president. It takes a talent to move a Category 4 hurricane barreling. Oh, actually, it's touched land now in Texas, which is, as Brian said, it will kill people, unfortunately, and it will harm a lot of people. People are under distress and stress now. Just to give a visual image of it, if you are now hunkered down, emergency management officials have asked for you to put your Social Security number, to write it on your arm. That is because of fear that they will not be able to get to you in time, and they won't be able to identify you. I don't need to spell it out more clearly. That's what we are facing. The sheriff pardon, the Arpaio pardon is not only, it's disgraceful for a lot of reasons. I'll just say, I find it just such an insult to the very people we're talking about, emergency managers, law enforcement, people in public safety, who every day do their jobs really successfully without violating the rule of law. And it also empowers that very small group of them who are harmful and damage communities of color and immigrant communities and target women. It emboldens them to do what they ought not to do. And in the end, we're here on a Friday night talking about these specific issues. Who's in with the president? Who's not in with the president? Who did him a favor? Who endorsed him early? And there is a Category 4 hurricane hovering over Texas for the next couple of days, and nothing. I have to be honest, I'm really impressed with FEMA. I'm really impressed with the Homeland Security Advisor. But we have a president who seems disinterested in the most important part of his job, which is the safety and security of this nation.
He did tweet out, in the 9 p.m. hour that he's supported the federal disaster declaration. And I do think it's worth noting it is. I think, the risk of kind of being meta here. I think we are right to be talking about Arpaio and Gorka and not just the hurricane, because if the goal is to distract, somehow to use this hurricane, this natural disaster, to get folks not to pay attention to these moves, that would be a bad...
But Brian, of course we have the right. It's news. And news.
Oh,
that's right.
Cable news network.
But if the goal is to try to cover it up...
But understand. But also, Juliet, you've got to. If you're the president of the United States and you're in the administration and you understand what damage a hurricane can cause to people's lives, to belongings, to whatever, then you would wait until, as Steve King said, why don't you wait till Monday or until you know what's happened there?
If you're proud of it.
But Don and Brian, Brian, let me just say one thing. That's absolutely right. And so then you have to think, they knew we would be covering this. And I guess I'm not the media analyst, but I don't think this is a news dump. I think the sheriff's story is something that the president very much wanted us to be talking about, because I think it's a signal to people about what kind of law enforcement he wants. It's a signal about pardoning, and it's a signal about his priorities right now. I think he anticipated we would be talking about it. I would definitely prefer to have a president who was only focused on the Category 4 hurricane. But I believe that he knew. I think he knows how we would react.
Yeah. Douglas, maybe he can't stand not being the lead story.
Yeah, I think he didn't want to be usurped by Hurricane Harvey. He needs to have his name in the news cycle.
Really?
Look, this was a way for Donald Trump, I think, to have taken a leadership role. We have a Category 4 storm slamming into Texas right now. Instead, he chose to do a news dump. As I was in New Orleans for Katrina. I used to live in the Mississippi coast, and cities like Waveland and Gulfport, Bay St. Louis were just leveled. We're looking at Port Aransas and Rockport tonight as we're talking that are virtually going to be underwater. And here President Trump playing all these different kinds of games with us yet again tonight. I think it was a missed opportunity for him to be, particularly with Joe Arpaio only less than 2 weeks after Charlottesville, with people still very raw about what happened there, knowing what a lightning rod figure he was for Latinos, and he ends up doing this on the evening of a catastrophic storm. It's another low mark for, I think, President Trump's leadership skills.
Yeah. Okay. Stand by, everyone. I got to get someone in. So thank you all.
Oh, but today the topic is Joe Arpaio, and I totally forgot to mention that Trump also forgave a Heinrich Himmler type who used to run what he himself, Joe Arpaio, called a concentration camp. passing as an Arizona county prison. I have two guests today to talk about the Arpaio pardon. The first is Antonia Nori Farzan. She's a reporter at the Phoenix New-Times, where they've been on the Sheriff Joe Arpaio beat for these 20 years. She's going to tell us who he is and how what he's done is, in an absolute sense, unpardonable. And then we have Slate's own Mark Joseph Stern to tell us about the pardon and how constitutionally Arpaio is all too pardonable. We'll be back to talk to Antonia and Mark after this. My first guest today is Antonia Nori Farzan. She's a reporter at the Phoenix New-Times. Welcome, Antonia.
Thanks for having me.
So you are a reporter at the Phoenix New-Times, which has now attracted a lot of interest because for 20 years, the Phoenix New-Times has been reporting on Sheriff Joe Arpaio, our recently pardoned friend of the president. And for those of us for whom his name is relatively new, maybe we learned about him 6 months ago, our producer, Jason, has read about him in the Spanish press for years, but I think a lot of the English language press has not given him the kind of coverage outside of Arizona that you all have. So tell us about Joe Arpaio. Who's this guy?
Yeah, so we were reporting on him for years, long before really anyone else was in the local media, or at least no one else was looking at him from a critical eye. And what he's probably most known for, what got him into trouble, was racial profiling. He decided basically to be the immigration police, which was in no way part of his duties as a county sheriff. So he would conduct immigration sweeps, workplace raids. 2011 Department of Justice investigation found that his department carried out the worst racial profiling they'd ever seen in U.S. history because he kept pulling over Latino drivers, stopping Latinos for no reason other than that they were speaking Spanish, and questioning them about their immigration status. But the other side of it that people hear about less often is in terms of his abuses of power, but also what went on in his jails, where it was just really incredibly inhumane treatment that inmates there dealt with. There is a stunningly high death rate. People were kept outside in tents where the temperatures reached 145 degrees and their shoes melted. He had live webcasts of inmates, including one from the women's bathroom that anyone could tune into online. And he also loved investigating his political enemies. He, at one point, took the founders and owners of our paper and threw them into jail because we published his address, which he did not like.
Founders.
And he also...
Wait, I'm sorry. These are your employers at the Phoenix New-Times. Yeah,
they're not the owners of the paper anymore, but they were at the time. Yeah,
I see. And he
didn't like our coverage of him.
And what was his pretext for arresting them?
Well, it's a bit of a long story, but basically he said they had violated the secrecy of a grand jury. That grand jury, in fact, had never convened, so we ended up winning a $3.75 million settlement for that one.
You mentioned violence, and now you're mentioning $1 million payouts. This has actually cost the county his penchant for violence and inhumane treatment of completely innocent Latinos in his racial profiling. And then in prison, some people awaiting trial, some people convicted. Many of them have died on his watch. I think the number is something like 157, of whom a couple of dozen, maybe 34, 36 or something like that, are hanging, suicide by hanging. The county has had to pay out for some of these deaths.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the total we're at right now is $70 million for the racial profiling case, $40 million for when he was investigating his political enemies and the judge who told him he couldn't racially profile anymore, and tens of millions for prisoner deaths. So I honestly don't even know what the total is in terms of what he's cost the county altogether. But I can tell you that's a big part of why he didn't win re-election in 2016 is a lot of conservative people who had, up until that point, supported him, basically took a look and said, this guy is getting too expensive. We're paying too much in taxes for him.
Oy. So the tent city that you've written about fairly recently, and temperatures in Arizona are it's still quite hot there right now. The tent city, even though he's no longer superintending it, is very hot. And that's the part of the jail that he described, right, as a concentration camp.
Yep, he described it himself as a concentration camp. And in Arizona, I mean, the average temperature all through the summer will be around 110 degrees. And you have people who are in tents who have nowhere to go to get away from the heat. And that's where you see a lot of these deaths happening, especially with people who are taking medications who make them especially sensitive to the heat. But just heat stroke, heat exhaustion, dehydration, and, neglect from guards who let stuff go untreated when people were having adverse reactions to the heat.
And, as I alluded to, some of these people are awaiting trial. It's a county prison. They are presumed innocent. But some of the ways that pregnant women and their stillborn or miscarried children have been treated is also come under suspicion and in some cases, court cases. Can you tell us about any of that? I know the New Times has covered that assiduously.
Yeah, that was another thing that led to a number of lawsuits was women who would be in jail. In some cases, like you said, they were presumed innocent and waiting for trial. In other cases, maybe they were there for drunk driving charges, as in one specific case we looked at where a woman's daughter was born stillborn, basically because she was having complications. She was in pain. She knew something was wrong, and she didn't get any medical treatment to address what was happening. So often it was just a case of neglect, and I believe there's also an investigation that found that the water in the area where pregnant woman was housed had been contaminated by mice and by mouse feces. So you had exposure to toxoplasmosis, which obviously causes all kinds of problems. So it wasn't just the medical neglect, but also just the fact that they were being kept in conditions which no one should ever be living in, but especially not a pregnant woman.
He also, Arpaio, seems obsessed with certain optics, publicity stunts, and New Times, which, we should point out to people who don't read it outside of Arizona, is an extremely lively paper that pulls no punches in the spirit of indie news, and very openly says these are medieval conditions in Maricopa County, and barbarism, I think one article says, reigns in some of Arpaio's showpieces. Didn't he put some of the Hispanic prisoners in stripes and march them in some kind of segregated, I don't know what to call this. Ritual humiliation.
No, it was really a segregated area. Yeah, I mean, he humiliated all prisoners. He had them wear pink underwear. He fed them green bologna. He took pride in feeding them moldy food. But Hispanic prisoners especially, he made a stunt of marching them into an area that was fenced off, that was kind of a segregated prison yard for them. And guards would call them racial slurs. Female inmates, particularly female Hispanic inmates, would be denied stuff like menstrual pads. So just really pure humiliation.
And just to point out how grotesque and surreal this gets with him, what about this phony murder plot?
Oh, yeah, that's so weird. That's one of the weirdest parts that does not get as much attention as it should. So he was up for re-election, and as a publicity stunt and to gain sympathy for himself, he paid someone to try and assassinate him so that he could then investigate it and send the guy to prison. If it sounds like that makes no sense, it's because it makes no sense.
So, the odd thing is that when he was finally convicted of something, it was not abuse of power, criminal negligence, or some other kind of, second-degree murder. He was, and not even search and seizure, a constitutional violation of the Fourth Amendment. He ended up getting a misdemeanor, convicted of a misdemeanor, contempt of court. How did that go down?
Right, yeah. So it is pretty staggering that out of everything he did, the one thing they were finally able to get him for was contempt of court. And that's because he had a court order from a federal judge telling him basically, hey, you need to stop racially profiling people. And he didn't. And he claimed in court that he knew nothing about it, that he wasn't involved in day-to-day operations. But because he loves publicity so much, there were at least 10 examples where he had gone on TV and openly said that he was ignoring the judge's order and continuing to racially profile people. So, yeah, just recently he got 6 months for contempt. Honestly, I think a lot of people at the time, the reaction was pretty muted, and I think a lot of people kind of had the sense that he was never going to serve a single day for you.
He sounds a little bit like in the telling tales on himself and the just continuing violation of even the most baseline mores of existence in civil society. A little bit like, wait, let me think, the president. One of the themes of Trumpcast has been how astonishing it is that Trump seems to wake up in the morning and, decide the most cartoonishly evil and objectionable thing he can do and do it, but that there are enough Mike Flynn's and Jeff Sessionses and apparently Joe Arpaios around who give him ballast and support and are happy to play monster with him. What is, this may seem like a tributary, but what is Senator McCain's relationship with Joe Arpaio?
Yeah, well, it's been interesting. He condemned the pardon, and so did our other Senator, Jeff Slate. So you've seen them kind of distancing themselves from him, although I think a lot of people feel that they could have taken a stronger stance when Arpaio was actually in office to stand up against what he was doing at the time, which they didn't.
And and now let's get to the pardon itself. We heard at the top of the show, Arpaio, and I'm changing my pronunciation very consciously. I realized I'd had it wrong all the time. Arpaio, when he says he first got the pardon, and in the video of this, which is interesting to watch, he's looking at something that looks like it's on copy paper. Just for the record, pardons don't look quite as creamy and beautiful as I thought they might look, presidential pardons.
It does look kind of fake.
It doesn't it? Yeah. Well, and even Arpaio knows himself well enough to say he's very good at spotting fake government documents. I don't know what will come of this pardon, and what is Phoenix making of this pardon?
Yeah, well, Arpaio has said that he wants to get back in political life now, which has a lot of people banging their heads against the wall because I shouldn't say everyone, but a lot of people were very happy to see him out of office. And, the one good thing on election day, Trump won, but Arpaio got out. So it's kind of weird timing. The reaction in Phoenix, definitely, obviously you have the stalwart Arpaio supporters who say he was just doing his job. This was a political witch hunt against him. People who are anti-immigration are obviously very supportive of him. And what's funny is a lot of people have accused the judge who charged him with contempt of court of being politically motivated in some way because of the whole Obama birtherism thing. Mm-hmm. But the judge was actually an appointee of George W. Bush, so that's just flat out not true. In terms of how Latino groups and immigrants' rights groups in Phoenix are feeling, people are really, really upset. Last night, there was a lot of crying. The big protests that happened on Tuesday were very much motivated by the fact that everyone knew the pardon was in the works and was coming at some point. Trump definitely hinted at it in his speech when he was in Phoenix. So that definitely led to a lot of the anger that was out there. Definitely no one's surprised. I mean, everyone knew this was coming, but it still definitely feels like a slap on the face to people who were terrorized by him for decades.
He wasn't in prison when this happened. It's not something where he's now let out and liberated by this. It's simply expunged from his record that he ever committed this misdemeanor. Is there any chance that there are other, maybe bigger charges brought against him? As I understand it, presidential pardons are only for specific crimes.
Right, yeah, and that's part of what's so weird about it is that he didn't even get to the sentencing yet. It was very soon for that to happen, and I think people honestly thought Trump would at least give it a couple of weeks or months and not a matter of days, but yeah, in terms of what could be coming next, I know there has been talk about civil suits coming against him, just in terms of all the different forms of abuse people endured. I'm not aware of any criminal charges that are coming down the line at this point, but it will definitely be interesting to see.
And now I really want to, because one of the subtexts of some of the last few episodes of our podcast has been sort of what next. So even if it's just that Trump is irrevocably stymied, by Congress with legislation, with the Russia investigation, best case scenario for him is just that he's stuck. Worst case is that for him again, best case for the nation, is that he resigns or is impeached or indicted. But there's something that suggests we're wondering what's going to come after. What's going to come after? Are we going to see murderous skirmishes like Charlottesville? Are we going to see even something worse than that? And what are you sensing in these protests in the county and in Arizona at large? I mean, is there support for him among the far right? I mean, armed support, demonstrators who would push back on protesters.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, definitely. He does have a very strong base in Arizona that was out in full force on Tuesday night at his rally.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we had bikers for Trump showing up with their guns. It is interesting because Phoenix is a city that voted for Clinton, and that tends to be predominantly Democratic voters. So there were a lot of clashes, luckily nonviolent ones, but definitely it's very tense. And I think one of the main effects of this pardon is that a lot of people have really lost the level of trust in the justice system by seeing someone who broke the law and violated the Constitution so many times can get away with having no consequences. Versus if you're a person of color, you absolutely do face consequences, possibly far beyond what you even did in the first place. And in fact, our governor went on record last year saying, if you commit a crime in Arizona, you're going to do your sentence. Then just yesterday, when the Arpaio pardon comes out, his reaction was that he was glad to close this chapter of Arizona history, and he was a friend of Arpaio's and hopes that he can enjoy his retirement with his wife. So I think a lot of the hypocrisy in that system is really being revealed right now, and that's led to a lot of frustration, a lot of distress, which definitely will stick around long after Trump is no longer in office.
I have to admit that to get some of the details right about Arpaio, I went to Wikipedia, where, of course, people had quickly added the pardon. And one of the first places I looked, and I look at this sometimes when I look up, Stephen Bannon or whatever, was his age. Because I just was like, please be 80. And indeed, he's 84. So there's a tiny bit of hope to be drawn from the number 84. Otherwise, it seems like a tense time in Phoenix, and as it is in the rest of the country. Thanks for being here.
Definitely. Thanks for having me.
Our second guest today is Slate's own Mark Joseph Stern to tell us about the legal and constitutional implications of the pardon of Joe Arpaio. Welcome, MJS.
Thanks for having me on. Always happy to talk about Arizona and the country's worst sheriff and monster in law enforcement.
It's extraordinary. He's yet another one of the cast of grotesques that we've been treated to during the desolation. And we just spoke to a wonderful Arizona Phoenix reporter who sort of walked us through, A, who Arpaio is and was and what he's done, and then B, what might happen on the occasion of his pardon in our restless population. So what I'd like you to talk us through is what this means legally, this pardon. People seem to read it two different ways, and maybe you have a third way, or you can tell me otherwise. The first is that it's priming the pump for bigger pardons of maybe Paul Manafort or Michael Flynn. And the second is that it's red meat to the base. Do either of those hypotheses ring true to you, or you read it another way entirely?
They both ring true. I think it's important at the outset to clarify that this is an extremely unusual pardon, both procedurally and substantively. As I'm sure you know, the pardon power is typically exercised by presidents in a very routine manner. Prisoners and individuals apply for clemency. The Justice Department has this entire process in place. They select good candidates using guidelines that have been approved by the president, and then the president chooses individuals to pardon and individuals who deserve to have their sentences commuted. And obviously none of that happened here. This is the very first pardon of Trump's presidency. Arpaio did not formally request the pardon as historically is required. Instead, Trump decided to just sort of volunteer it, and Arpaio said, sure, I wouldn't mind that. And then Trump just went ahead and did it. The White House drafted up the paperwork, and it happened. There's no question that he is allowed to do that. But it's very, very weird for the president to intervene at first, unprompted, unsolicited by the individual, but second, in the middle of the process, which is what Trump did here. Recall that Arpaio has not yet been sentenced. He has been convicted of contempt of court, but he has not been sentenced. And in fact, it seems pretty unlikely that if he were sentenced, that he would have any jail time. It's not the kind of thing that judges typically send 85-year-olds to prison for. So what Trump has basically done here, I think, is carved out this kind of exception for his friends and associates. And he's used Arpaio as a model or a precedent where he says, look, if you're my pal and a court is ordering you to do something and you refuse to do it, which is what happened with Arpaio. He was ordered to stop racially profiling, but he continued nonetheless, and then he was convicted of criminal contempt of court. Trump is basically saying, I will step in and help you out. I will make sure that you do not face consequences for refusing to comply with the courts. It is constitutionally a perfectly sound thing to do. I mean, there's no question that he's allowed to do this. The issue is whether he is obstructing justice, and that leads us to a more fundamentally political question, because, of course, impeachment in our system, it's not purely statutory crimes. It's something much broader than that. And so Congress is in this sticky situation where now it has to figure out, look, Trump clearly obstructed justice here. There's probably not a better way to describe what he did, intervening in the middle of this criminal process to let Arpaio off the hook. The question now is, will Congress just let him get away with it scot-free? Will there be any noises about impeachment? And if not, will Trump take that as a sign that he basically succeeded in establishing this precedent, and moving forward, he will be able to continue to pardon his friends who refuse to comply with courts and judges?
It seems like we or you and some of the legal scholars who've written about this are not the only ones who were squeamish about the pardon power, that it could be abused and that it could even be grounds for impeachment. I think Noah Feldman says that no less than James Madison worried about this at the Constitutional Convention. What do you think? I mean, does it matter if we decide something else is grounds for impeachment if the Congress isn't moving to impeach?
Well, I think that Noah Feldman's piece is excellent. The James Madison quote is definitely spot on. The question for me is whether the president continues to use this technique. Like I said, he's done something very specific and strange, where he has he's looked at a case where someone refused to comply with a court order and said, I, the president, am going to relieve you of any potential punishment. That sets this dangerous precedent where take someone like Flynn or Manafort or one of his associates who's staring down subpoenas right now. Well, if they comply with these subpoenas, then they could be found to have committed some pretty serious wrongdoing. There's not really an upside for them to comply with the subpoenas if they know that if they do not comply with the subpoenas, and all they're going to do is be held in contempt of court, and then they can ask their good old friend Trump to step back in and, pardon them. So again, it's almost like this escape hatch that Trump has created for his associates, where you don't have to worry about complying with judges or investigators or grand juries or whatever. You can just refuse, and then Trump will say, oh, I'm not pardoning him for colluding with Russia or anything like that. I'm just pardoning him because he was subjected to a witch hunt just like Joe Arpaio, and I don't think that's fair.
Okay, I've got two more questions for you. Every time Trump comes in and just breaks shit, I just despair that the founders didn't put enough provisions in to keep someone like him from doing this to the republic. And then I get a flicker of hope that the law will reassert itself. In this case, there's been talk of pardoned people cannot invoke the Fifth Amendment. Is that right?
Yes, it's kind of tricky case law, but broadly that seems to be correct.
And maybe you can tell me why, but maybe what's more germane is what might that mean? Some people think that might turn Flynn and, say, Sessions, a big taker of the Fifth, into better witnesses.
I mean, that's the theory that's floating around. My concern is that there's no end to Trump's pardon power. And so, yes, the theory here is basically if Trump pardons Flynn of everything and then Flynn is called to testify, then he can't take the Fifth and say, no, it would be self-incrimination, I'm not going to talk. But if Flynn just said, no, I'm still not going to testify, the worst thing that could happen would that he'd be held in contempt of court
and then
again.
Be pardoned again.
And it seems like we go through this whole cycle where, and I think that, the investigators or the courts or whoever is doing this in this hypothetical would quickly tire of that routine. And again, like this sort of goes to your initial observation. There is no clear limit to how Trump can use this pardon power. It's actually very depressing because for a long time, the pardon power in the United States functioned very well. It was used as a kind of safety valve for an overly harsh criminal justice system. But it's cases like this one and Mark Rich and a few others that have really soured the public on the pardon power. So unfortunately, people who really do deserve to be pardoned are not, and people who do not deserve to be pardoned, like Arpaio, get a free pass.
Okay. This is the very last question, but it might open up 5 more minutes of conversation. Antonio Farzan at the New Times said that he may be facing civil legislation for these wrongful deaths because of course he's not inoculated by a pardon against further lawsuits. This pardon only applies to the contempt of court charge for which he was awaiting sentencing.
Yes, and only to the criminal contempt of court charge.
Only the criminal,
He's
right.
only pardoned for an actual crime, not a civil offense. So yes, there's continued civil litigation and all kinds of messy stuff that he's going to be dealing with probably for the rest of his life, which is why shortly after he was pardoned, he tweeted out a link to the Joe Arpaio Defense Fund where you can donate your hard-earned dollars to help defend him. In fact,
that link will be all over Slate. I'm sure you'll put it top of the GoFundMe for Arpaio.
The citizens of Arizona have actually already paid out about $150 million in settlements for his misconduct.
It's amazing. Apparently that's why he didn't get reelected, not the cruel and unusual punishment, constitutional violations, contempt of court, just being a horrible person, but he was just getting too expensive.
Hey, whatever it takes.
Thank you so much for being here. It's really great to talk to you.
Thanks a lot. Always a pleasure.
President Trump's advisor, Sebastian Gorka, is out. The president pardoning controversial sheriff Joe Arpaio of his conviction for criminal contempt. Time to bring in now my panel. CNN's legal analyst, Laura Coates, is here. CNN national security analyst, Julia Kayyem, a former Homeland Security official. Senior economics analyst, Stephen Moore, who was a senior advisor to the Trump campaign. And CNN political commentator, Anna Navarro. It's so good to have all of you on. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. A very busy news night. What happened to slow Friday news nights? I've tweeted out earlier, it's of a time gone by. Laura, I have to start with you because we've got a handful of big stories that I want to talk about. But I need to start with President Trump's pardoning of Joe Arpaio, very controversial sheriff. The sheriff has responded. I want to put up what he said via Twitter, and he says, "Thank you, Donald Trump, for seeing my conviction for what it is, a political witch hunt by holdovers in the Obama Justice Department." What are your thoughts on this pardon? Holdovers?
No, I don't think this was a political prosecution. And it is a political pardon. But to suggest that in a prosecution that began with a 10-year review of his conduct of racial profiling of Latinos in his home state and flouting the Fourth Amendment, ignoring it, and over a series of different years deciding not to follow the instructions of a court that said that he had to adhere to this little thing called the Fourth Amendment should surprise a lot of people that would be called a political witch hunt hunt or a political prosecution. I've heard other commentators on different shows today discuss that as a witch hunt of sorts, and now you have Arpaio himself saying that it is. But in fact, it is not. And what it is a confirmation that this particular president does not seem to understand either the constitutional premises that force us to look at how police conduct should be viewed in this country, or the separation of powers, and that you must respect the rule of law, and in particular an order by a judge that says that you have broken a law. One would think that would be a very, very easy thing to do when you, in fact, have been a sheriff who has served for 24 years in that particular state. And only in your final bid, your 7th bid, did you lose office when this prosecution happened to commence after a 10-year review of your conduct.
Interesting assessment. Interesting assessment. We'll get to all of that. But Anna, I've been wanting to talk to you because I want to know the message of pardoning Joe Arpaio. What does that send to the Latino community and to the country as a whole?
I would tell you that for the vast majority of Latinos, it is a slap in the face. It is painful. It is hurtful. It is an act that makes us indignant, mad as hell. And it just tells a lot of Latinos that Donald Trump does not have your back, does not care what you think or what you feel. And in fact, Don, if you allow me, I was just reading the statement that was put out tonight by the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, which includes several Republicans, prominent Republicans on their board. It represents over 6,000 Latino elected and appointed officials. And what they say is, a pardon of Arpaio is an endorsement of racism from the highest office in the land, signaling to Americans that discriminatory behavior and a blatant disregard for the judicial process is acceptable. That kind of act is an extraordinary intervention in our justice system. They go on to say, by pardoning Arpaio, President Trump is turning his back on the values we hold dear as a nation and continuing a pattern of behavior that demonstrates a profound disrespect for the significant contributions of Latinos and immigrants that made to this country every day. I think that's a lot of Latinos feeling that way tonight, including myself.
Stephen Moore, I want to get your response now, because a lot of people, including some Republicans, are saying that even though the president's pardon power is his to exercise, this pardon goes against the rule of law. What's your reaction to that?
Well, you know, look, I don't really know the facts of this case, Don, very well, so I can't really comment on it. I am, you know, the other big story that you were talking about is Sebastian Gorka leaving, and that's something that concerns me a little bit because, you know, if you think about Steve Bannon leaving and Gorka leaving, these are people that I work with on the campaign, and they were people who were kind of with Trump at the beginning. And it's interesting how the White House now is being kind of hollowed out of the people who were with Trump, you know, from the start, when you have so many of these people leaving and this new crowd coming in. So that's a concern of mine tonight.
Why is that concerning?
Because I think, you know, there's a lot of people who want Trump to be Trump and want Trump to be true to the kind of voters who elected him and the promises that he made. And so far, I think, by the way, he has a good score in that regard. I mean, he has fulfilled
how does Sebastian
a lot of the
Gorka, how does he play into this? What piece of the puzzle is that, by getting rid of
Sebastian
Gorka?
I'm not a foreign,
can't be Trump?
Don, I'm not a foreign policy guy, and Sebastian is. But, you know, what he did, I think, very effectively was he was a very strong voice in the war against terror, and that's one of the reasons he's very well respected by conservatives.
But he had no real foreign policy experience. That was a criticism of him. He just was sort of seen as a mouthpiece and someone who was very controversial and, you know, wore something that resembled a sort of Nazi thing on his pendant on his coat on occasion.
Well, look, I got to know him very well. And again, I'm not a foreign policy expert, but boy, I think he really knew his stuff. I think he was very aware of what was going on in the Middle East. I think he was an expert in the war on terror, and I think he will be missed. And I don't know the circumstances, Don, of why he was replaced. I know some of the people who've been you know, removed from the White House are people who were leakers. I don't know if he falls in that category, but all I can say is that he's somebody I really came to respect, having worked with him on the campaign.
Usually, and I know you said...
May I ask Stephen something?
Yeah, go for it, Anna. Go ahead.
Steve, you and I are friends. You and I have worked for years,
we
decades,
sure have.
on immigration issues, on trying to pass comprehensive immigration reform. You got asked to respond to the Joe Arpaio pardoning.
That's where I was going.
You didn't know the facts. You deflected to Gorka.
Yeah.
Now, I know your heart, Steve Moore. You know what Joe Arpaio means to Latinos in this country. You know what he means to immigrants. Right. You know that he has racially profiled. I know you are against that. So I am asking you today not to leave me alone here as a Republican, being the only one condemning it, well, look, because I know you for years. And, you know, come on, Steve.
Well, you know, I'm very pro-immigrant. I'm very pro-Hispanic. I think that the Latino immigrants who come to this country, the vast majority of them are great contributors to our country. The reason I can't comment on this, frankly, Don, is I just don't know the facts of the case. So it's hard for me to, to pass judgment on what he was.
All these years that you've been
of.
around, hold on, Anna, because this is where I was going, and I'll let you jump back in. But my question was going to be, all these years that you've been around, and you're a very learned man. You know about Sheriff Joe Arpaio. You know about the pink underwear. You know about what's happened with immigrants. You've worked with Anna, as she said, and as the only other conservative on the panel, I just wanted to get your response. And the question was, because presidents usually pardon people on their way out, not at the start of their presidency.
I'm just hesitant to talk about it. I will simply say this: that I think Anna raises a good point about Trump has to. There's a lot I admire about Donald Trump, but one of the things he has to do as president is learn how to expand this base and to talk more sensitively to blacks and Hispanics. And, if Anna is right about this, that he is toxic to the Hispanic community, then it may have been a big political mistake. But again, I have to say I don't know the facts of what he was charged with. And in fact, we were talking about this in the green room before. I didn't even know.
What about
that
the timing after Charlotte and so on, and the building the wall and the Muslim ban and all of that?
Well, I'm for the wall, and the reason I'm for the wall is because I think that's become a precondition. Anna may have a different opinion on this. I think building the wall has been kind of a precondition to getting immigration reform done, so we can get more legal immigrants to this country. And I think the conservatives come around to the opinion that until we have a secure border, we can't do the kind of comprehensive immigration where we can let in more, workers who will be so beneficial to our country. But until that wall is built and Americans feel like the border is secure, I just don't think there's the political will to expand our legal immigration system, which is something
I've got a theory and a proposition about that wall that I will share later. But Anna,
John, I have to say this. I'm sorry, because I actually do know the facts of this case, and I know them quite well. And the facts of the case that are important for everyone to understand is that it's not about whether or not there was actually legal or illegal immigrants who were at the mercy of Sheriff Arpaio. There was a sheriff who took it upon himself to decide that he alone could decide what was valid under the Fourth Amendment for a search, a stop, or a prolonged patrol action. And he decided to ask people whether or not they fit his description of what a legal immigrant looked like, sounded like, walked like, talked like, and looked like. And on that basis alone, he was engaging in racial profiling. And when the courts repeatedly told him to remind him that there is a Fourth Amendment and you cannot racially profile under any circumstances, he said, I will do what I want and I will not allow the federal government to interfere with my objective. That being to constitutionally undermine anybody's rights in his home territory. Now, the people of Arizona already decided that he was not worthy of a re-election, but it was not based on a politicization of whether or not you should build a wall to oust legal or illegal immigrants. It was about a very, very specific and nuanced fact, which is the Fourth Amendment. Either you appreciate and will follow it, or you will not and should not be the mayor, sheriff, president, senator, or anything else.
Juliette Cayenne, what do you make of all this tonight?
I'm watching a Hurricane 4, Category 4 coming towards Texas, and we're talking about Donald Trump. It's remarkable to me, as someone who has spent a career in Homeland Security and public safety, that as we are looking at a time when we need government to work, we need our president to focus, we need the Homeland Security and emergency management efforts on the local, state, and national level to work together and coordinate and to be led by someone, a president. We are talking, not insignificantly, these are huge stories, but we are talking about, the pardoning of a racist. There's just no better word for the sheriff. I mean, it's not a legal term. I just read the newspaper. Whether Gorka, who, while he didn't have a clear docket for those of us in counterterrorism, he was exceptionally divisive when it came to Muslim and Arab issues. So I do think he did have some impact in that regard. And so just taking a step back, it's just remarkable to me that we are facing a crisis that Trump ought to be leading. And that, I sort of just want to say, where is John Kelly? Like, where is he? And where is the leadership and the organization and the focus that we need right now from a White House at a time when this nation is about to face, or is facing, we've seen the pictures, a tremendous threat to those who are in the eye of the storm, literally.